Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. In discussions about video games as art, one question comes up fairly often. When will a video game make us cry? Well, the answer is, they've been doing it for decades now. Shut up! But if you want to be a little more polite to the person asking, then you could simply hand them a copy of Telltale's The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead started as a comic written by Robert Kirkman and published by Image Comics. It offered a zombie apocalypse rooted not in gory zombie action so much as genuine human drama, and it got popular enough to spawn an entire franchise of spin-offs, adaptations, and merchandise, most of which tried to follow the same intent to varying degrees of success. Enter Telltale Games, who had mostly done more comedic work, adapting franchises like Back to the Future and Wallace and Gromit into modernized episodic adventure games to reasonable critical success. They decided to tell a story set in the Walking Dead universe, and by the time the first season of this episodic game was done, they were met with more critical and commercial success than ever before, and have since become a powerhouse for developing emotionally charged and morally challenging adventure games based on properties ranging from Game of Thrones to Borderlands and even Minecraft. Beyond that, the game revitalized the adventure genre in a new format, directly influencing games like Life is Strange, Dreamfall Chapters, and the King's Quest reboot. Now, this is something of a first for Games as Lit 101. I have not yet on this show analyzed a game where your choices can change the basic events of the story so much. So, when it comes down to it, the summary I'm about to give here may differ a bit from your personal experience with the game, and if I wanted to make it completely accurate, I'd have to go into all sorts of detail on all the different choices and everything they could mean, and that would just be annoying and unnecessary. So I'm going to try and represent the story in a way that makes most clear what it is that happens and what it all means, and I'll try and note any major differences where they come up. Before we get started, a few details. First and foremost, spoilers. This video is an analysis of The Walking Dead's narrative and delivery, especially as it relates to the use of interactivity and player choice. That means I'm going to be talking about the story in full detail. This game is excellent, and for that matter, pretty influential, and I highly recommend that you experience it for yourself before watching this video. Also, this game is rated M and has some pretty strong language and graphic violence. Now, generally, I try to keep Games as Lit 101 appropriate for all ages, but obviously with a game like this, that's not really possible. So I'm not going to go out of my way to show the game's mature content, but I'm also not going to shy away from it, so do with that information what you will. Without further ado, let's get started. The game opens on your character, Lee Everett, being driven to jail. Okay, I know we just got started, but I have to stop for a second and talk about writing here, because this opening demonstrates Telltale's mastery over exposition very well. Exposition is important for basically any story, but if it's not done well, it can really break pacing or immersion. Whenever a character, stares at the screen and tells you something, or explains something that everyone else in the room already knows anyway, or even when a character has a weird, unexplainable gap in their knowledge just so someone else can explain it to them and consequently to you, the viewer or player, it just really makes things stilted and awkward. But this opening scene gets around those difficulties masterfully. Lee is mostly an avatar for the player, insofar as you'll end up with almost absolute control over his actions and words, but there are a few established elements of his character that largely exist to create an interesting context for him to interact with other characters. Some details about him will be revealed later, but there are a few basic things the player needs to know right off the bat if they're going to understand how to relate to him, which is more than a little important in a character that's meant to be a vessel for your choices. By setting the opening scene in the back of a police car, we already know some of this without anyone saying a word. Then the rest of it is established over well-written, natural dialogue in the form of a conversation between Lee and this police officer, who's just doing his job and actually believably doesn't know the details of Lee's case. Since you have control over Lee's dialogue, you have some level of influence over how he feels about what happened, but Telltale was careful to ensure that none of your options could really paint Lee as some kind of evil, cold-blooded killer. He is a murderer, but it was a crime of passion, not of malicious, predetermined hatred. And really, that's all we need to know about Lee to get started with this game. We do find out some more details later, specifically that the person he killed was a senator who had been sleeping with his wife. But really, that information is secondary to the simple goal of familiarizing us with this person that we will be inhabiting, and this scene accomplishes that very well just with some natural dialogue in an aptly chosen setting. But things go wrong, and Lee wakes up to find himself surrounded by zombies. He manages to escape to a fenced house where he meets a young girl named Clementine, whose parents are on vacation and...
Clementine, baby. If you can hear this, call the police. One. We love you. We love you. We love you.
Probably aren't doing too well. The player can opt for varying levels of not telling Clementine about that voicemail. They end up at a farm owned by a guy named Herschel. Yes, that Herschel and that farm. The one featured in a few issues of the comic and an entire torturous season of the show. This is before all of that takes place, and Lee meets a man named Kenny, along with his wife Katja and son Duck. Unfortunately, zombies happen, and while Kenny manages to save Duck, Herschel's son is killed. Now, this is the first of many examples of a particular kind of player choice we're going to be talking about a lot over the course of this analysis. The player has the option to save either Kenny's son or Herschel's son, but regardless of which you choose, Duck is going to survive and Herschel's son is going to die. Many would say this outcome means your choice here doesn't matter, and that's not quite accurate, but I'm going to save the explanation for after the summary, because this is far from the only choice like this in this game, and we'll be talking a lot about player choice in the final analysis. Herschel is understandably upset and forces everyone to leave the farm. Lee and Clementine stick with Kenny and his family and end up at a little shop with a few other survivors. Carly, who's an excellent shot, Doug, who's good with electronics, Lily, the harsh and decisive leader, and her father Larry, a grumpy old man with a heart condition. And also Glenn, who you may also recognize. Conflict arises over various issues, and it turns out that Larry and Carly both know about Lee and his past crimes. We also find out that this shop was owned by Lee's family, and he has to come to terms with their deaths. After a while of exploring and adventure game puzzling, everyone's ready to evacuate to a nearby motel, but the zombies break in and the player has the choice to either save Doug or Carly from being eaten. Now those are the events of episode 1, which makes it worth noting real quick right now that Telltale was actually one of the first companies to actually pull off an episodic release structure for their games. Before them, the highest profile episodic games were the Half-Life 2 episodes, and we all know how that turned out, and Alan Wake, which basically just split the game into chapters with previously on Alan Wake segments at the beginning of each one. Telltale started using episodic release schedules before this specific game, but the format is more common now in the industry at large, and that is largely due to the success of this game. Episode 2 opens with Lee bringing 2 survivors back to the hotel. One is wounded and dies, and despite not being bitten, comes back as a zombie. This is how the game reveals that in the Walking Dead universe, everyone is infected. Anyone who dies will become a walker regardless of whether they're bitten or not. The surviving addition to the group is Ben, a scared teenager, and Lily is not happy with you for adding another mouth to feed. To demonstrate why this is such a big deal, she gives you 3 small food items and puts you in charge of deciding who gets to eat today. What follows is one of the more impactful sequences in the game as you talk to everyone and decide which of them will eat and which will go hungry. Remember this one too. This particular sequence is an excellent example of Telltale's use of player choice to inform your decisions rather than alter the progression of the game, and we'll be talking about it in more detail later on. 2 strangers show up unexpectedly and offer to trade. Turns out they have a farm nearby that they've managed to protect pretty well using an electric fence powered by a generator, and they seem to live peaceful and well-fed lives. Most of this episode is interacting with them, exploring the farm, and dealing with some bandits that seem to be terrorizing them. But of course, it's all too good to be true, and the family turns out to be cannibalistic. How quickly you move determines whether you reveal this in time to stop Clementine from accidentally eating someone she knows, but regardless, everyone ends up trapped in a meat locker, and in the midst of the stress and his uncontrolled anger, Larry suffers a heart attack. Lily wants to keep trying to resuscitate him, but Kenny's concerned that he'll come back as a zombie and suggests destroying his brain now to keep that from happening. You can choose which one to do, but if you keep trying to save him, Kenny will eventually intervene and end it himself anyway. Again, yes, your choice here does actually matter. We'll get to it. Everyone escapes because Clementine is able to climb through a small air duct and unlock the door from the outside. This event is important for 2 reasons. First, it's the first time Clementine is able to really contribute to the team, and her bravery and growing competence is a major element of her character development. And secondly, because this is the room she comes out in. Because she won't have enough mental scars from all this already. In the chaos that ensues, you're given opportunities to either show mercy or kill the brothers at the farm while Clementine looks on, though mercy is fleeting since walkers are descending upon the farm anyway. On the way back to the motor inn, the group comes upon a car full of food. You can choose whether to take it with everyone else or follow Clementine's conscience and refuse. This episode makes it clearer than ever before that your actions are her example. So episode 1 was just the introduction. It introduced us to the major characters, established the narrative premise, and gave us a little taste of the kinds of choices we'll have to be making further down the line. Episode 2 then expanded on this by establishing more about how this world works, as well as making the point quite vividly that humanity is the real danger in this scenario, more so than the zombies. Which means episode 3 is where everything really starts going to hell. Food is getting scarce, and Kenny and Lily are butting heads as to whether they should leave in an RV Kenny just fixed up. If you saved Carly in the beginning, there's a really interesting bit where she recommends Lee tell some other people, whoever he trusts, about his crime, and the player is left to decide who, if anyone, they will tell. Throughout all this, Lily is just getting more unstable and paranoid, but some of her paranoia unfortunately turns out to be justified as Lee discovers, with the help of Ducktective here, that someone has been stealing medicine and hiding it outside the gate. Lily is about to start an inquisition to figure out who did it when bandits show up. Apparently that was left out there for them, and they were not happy about it being gone. The firefight that ensues results in walkers breaking in, and the group barely escapes in the RV. Unfortunately, when a walker fell on Katja and Duck, Duck was bitten, and he's slowly dying. There's a really emotional scene where you have to explain to Clementine that the only kid around her age is dying, and your role as her father figure just keeps crystallizing. Lily, unfortunately, is only getting more aggressive and paranoid, and when the RV needs to stop, she gets so infuriated she shoots Carly in cold blood, or if you saved Doug, she tries to shoot Ben, and Doug jumps in front of the bullet. You choose at this point whether to keep Lily with you or leave her on the side of the road. Eventually, the RV comes to a railroad crossing that's blocked by a partially wrecked train, and with the help of an old man named Chuck, who was just living in one of the cars, you get the train working and decide to follow the railway toward the coast. Eventually, you have to stop because Duck is catatonic by this point, and Katja makes the difficult decision to put him down rather than let him become a walker. It takes some convincing, but Kenny agrees, and they take him into the woods to say their goodbyes. Again, you have to explain this to Clementine, because making me explain the death of a child to another child wasn't heartbreaking enough the first time, I guess. When this happens.
Things are... What the...
No! Cat! Katja! Why? Cat? Honey? Oh, fucking God.
Yeah, Katja was so overcome with grief after watching her son slowly die for the last few hours that she uses the gun to take her own life. You then have the choice to shoot Duck yourself or have Kenny do it. This is the first part of the game that, by most accounts, really starts bringing the tears, and it's not all that difficult to see why. Duck could be kind of annoying, as Lee found out in that whole investigation segment, but it was because he was an excitable kid who somehow managed to retain his naive vigor despite the world going to hell around him. Most importantly, by this point, Kenny has become a rather important character, and seeing him completely broken is heartbreaking. His single most important defining trait as a character is his family, and every single decision he's made up to this point, good and bad, has been to protect them. They were literally everything to him, all he had as the world fell apart around him, and they were just taken from him in the form of the death of his child and the distraught suicide of his wife right in front of his eyes. The willful, sometimes dangerously angry family man we've come to know is now a broken, crying husk of his former self. Like I said, episode 3 is where it really all starts going to hell. By this point, nearly half the group is dead, Kenny is unresponsive with guilt, and the closest thing these characters have to a home is a train that's hurtling at very fast speeds towards a densely populated area in hopes of finding a boat that is still there and intact. Things aren't going so well. Two other important things happen here. First, Ben confesses that he was the one who was setting medicine out for the bandits back at the motor inn. They had approached him and threatened to attack if he didn't do it, and since Lily understandably scared him, he elected to do it himself in secret rather than telling anyone about it. Lee tells him to keep that quiet because those events led to Duck being bitten, and Kenny would not react well to that news. But also during this sequence is one of the most thematically important sequences in the game, preparing Clementine to fend for herself. You cut her hair so she can't be grabbed by zombies so easily, you teach her how to shoot so she can defend herself, and you come up with a plan for arriving in Savannah. Clementine is intent on searching for her parents since that's where they had gone on vacation. You decide how accommodating you want to be to this desire. Over the course of the game, we're seeing a shift from protecting Clementine to preparing her. It's becoming increasingly obvious that nothing is certain in this new world, and Lee is becoming more and more aware that he may not always be around to protect Clementine. So, she needs to learn to be self-sufficient, and it's up to us to decide what that looks like and prepare her for the brutality of the zombie apocalypse. At this point, it's pretty safe to say that fatherhood is one of the major themes of the first season of Telltale's Walking Dead. There are some stereotypically maternal things going on in some of your actions in this game, but generally speaking, things like protection and the desire to leave a lasting impact are stereotypically paternal traits, and this game plays to them fiercely. But beyond that, the simple act of preparing Clementine to defend herself is an acknowledgement that you can't protect her alone and that you can't protect her forever. There's been so much death now that it's impossible, or at least irresponsible, to continue protecting Clementine without coming to terms with your own mortality. You can't walk her down this road forever, so you need to equip her to do it herself. It's a sobering moment and marks the beginning of the game's true thematic significance, the legacy you'll leave for those who depend on you. Along the way to Savannah, the group ends up stopped by a wrecked tanker, and Krista and Omid join their ranks. What follows is mostly gameplay filler, unfortunately, but we do get a few good tidbits. This game is unfortunately at its weakest when it feels the need to insert puzzle sequences. The narrative-centric nature of the game does not mesh very well at all with the run around and click on everything until you find the thing that you need to continue through the game feel of classic adventure games that these puzzle sequences tend to borrow from. These sequences are usually fairly simple and never go into insane game logic to work, but they do tend to be kinda tedious and occasionally a little obtuse, and they really do interrupt the flow of the game. Thankfully, in later games, Telltale realized that their storytelling is why everyone plays them and stopped letting old genre conventions get in their way. In any case, here we get our first glimpse of Clementine and Lee really working together as a team, as well as a great scene where Lee is attacked by two walkers, and once he defeats them, we see that Clementine has a gun but was too afraid to actually use it. Ultimately, they get out of there and into Savannah, but not before realizing there are thousands of zombies behind them. Lee also gets a strange call on the broken walkie-talkie Clem carries around.
Can't wait for you to get to Savannah, Clementine. I got your parents right here, and you be sure to find me whether Lee wants you to or not. Now, what I need...
Holy shit.
I thought that fucking thing was broken.
So did I.
Episode 4 mostly consists of the group finding a house in Savannah and staying there while they search for a boat. While there, they come across a girl named Molly who survives on her own after running away from a nearby settlement called Crawford, as well as a small group of people who also ran away from Crawford. Turns out, Crawford decided not to allow the sick, elderly, or young to stay there. Anyone who could be considered a burden to society was just considered a waste of resources. So when they find a boat that just needs a battery and fuel to get working, the group decides to try and break into Crawford to get the supplies they need. Turns out, Crawford had an outbreak of its own, and everyone there is zombies now. The group manages to get everything it needs, including medicine for the other group they're working with, but Ben has been feeling guilty as he's gotten to know Kenny better, and blurts out that he was indirectly responsible for what happened at the motor pool. This...
You little pissant! You're fucking dead! You hear me? Dead! My wife and child! You got them both fucking killed!
doesn't go over well. The zombies push everyone through a bell tower, and this happens.
Hold on, Ben. I've got you. Ben, climb up. Come on, you can do it.
There's no time. You have to go now.
Fucking around, Ben. Come on.
Let go, damn it. Get Clem and the others out of here.
Lee. Lee, we both know. Let me go.
Now, of all the life and death decisions you make over the course of this game, this one is unique. The Walking Dead puts another character's life in your hands on a fairly regular basis, but usually weighed against some other consequence, or in response to immediate events. This choice here is asking you if you're going to let someone die not because of any consequences letting them live would have, and not because of anything that they're doing right now, but because of mistakes they have made in the past. He's clearly racked with guilt, and asking you to kill him is little more than his form of suicide. But there's plenty of time here. Pulling him up will clearly have no negative consequences. The only possible argument is that his death will ensure he can't screw anything else up, but that's not a very concrete claim. Ultimately, this is your opportunity to decide whether Ben is just a lost cause who deserves death for his previous transgressions, or a kid who's made mistakes and deserves life just as much as everyone else. We'll come back to this choice later as well, since it is an oft-maligned but still excellent example of how Telltale uses interactivity. When everyone gets back, Vernon heads back to his group with the medicine, but not before offering to take Clementine with him. He says she's not safe with Lee and suggests it would be best if he let her go with him. You can choose how to react to this, of course, which affects how the next scene will play out. Clementine is hopeful that you can find her parents, but of course that's not really an option, and Clementine cries herself to sleep. The next morning, she's gone. Lee looks for her, then... well, this happens.
No.
I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate that my summary cannot possibly contain the same thematic or emotional weight as the game itself, and this really is something that deserves to be experienced for yourself. So if you have not played this, please go do so, because I am about to read the Sparks notes for an experience that otherwise has the potential to change your life. You have the choice to tell everyone about the bite or keep it to yourself, then it's time to find out who will come with you to find Clementine. Lee assumes Vernon came back and took her, so the plan is to go back to his group and get Clementine back. You can have any combination of characters come with you on this depending on the choices you've made and how you approach this situation. Kenny's presence is going to depend on how your relationship with him is and whether you appeal to his sense of family. It takes a lot to keep him around if you decide to take Ben too, though. I'm just going to approach this summary based on bringing all of them along. When the group gets to Vernon's group headquarters, they're all gone. This is, of course, when the giant horde we saw at the end of episode 3 comes shambling into town, and Clementine's radio comes alive.
Who is this?
It's not Vernon, if that's what you're thinking. And you should really watch your tone. Clementine's fine, but if I were you, I'd choose my next words very carefully.
Lee's bite is starting to affect him, and he begins to faint periodically. At one point, he wakes up on an operating table with everyone around him ready to cut off his arm in hopes of stopping the infection. It's your choice whether to let them or not, and this will affect the ease of a few situations in the future. The goal for the moment is just to get back to the house and try and find Clementine's location from there, and eventually they all manage to get there only to find that the boat is gone. In its place, a note from Vernon saying he regretted taking it and leaving them and Clementine without it. So he hadn't taken her, but their plan has still gone entirely to hell. Kenny vents his anger on Ben for the bazillionth time, but in a very formative scene, Ben finally finds the strength to yell back.
I am so sorry about Katja and Duck. I am! And I know I fucked up. But stop pushing me around and stop wishing I was dead! No! You know how they die. You've said goodbye. I never got to see my family, my parents, my little sister. Do you get that? Your family is gone, but at least you had them to lose. I never made it home. They could be alive or dead or walkers or worse, and I don't know. So give me a fucking break!
Oh, Ben,
Unfortunately, soon after this, zombies get into the house and force everyone into the attic. Clementine gets on the radio and tells Lee she's at the Marsh house where her parents were staying before she gets cut off. They manage to all get into the next house over, where they come across a couple who seem to have killed themselves rather than face the undead. From there, they try to cross the rooftops since the streets are full of walkers.
Ben!
What happens here is obviously going to depend on whether Ben is alive in your game and what's been going on with Kenny, but I'm going to cover this because it's a very, very important scene. Kenny goes down to try and help Ben, and you follow him. Unfortunately, this isn't something he can get back up from, especially once the walkers notice and start closing in. Kenny tells you to get out of there, armed with only a gun and a single bullet.
Katja wouldn't want this. Damn it, Ken! Yeah, she would. I either save the kid or I get to see her. Either way. Now get back up there.
Go get that girl. Back, you sons of bitches!
Damn it, Kenny! God damn it!
Oh, fuck! Kenny, please!
Lee has trouble with this, as Kenny was his closest friend in all of this, but they continue on. Eventually, they get to the Marsh house, and Lee is separated from Omid and Krista. You choose where to tell them to meet you, then Lee climbs down, arms himself as best he can, and simply marches through the walkers, knowing that he's a dead man anyway and has nothing to lose as long as he can get to Clementine. When he does get into the Marsh house, we end up in a confrontation with the man who was talking to Clementine on the radio, a man with a very familiar station wagon parked out front. Yes, this is the owner of the car from which everyone stole food earlier on. He tells his story about the disappearance of his son, how their food was gone when they got back from searching, how his wife took their daughter and wound up dead on the street.
After I heard Clementine on the radio and realized who you folks were, I came after you purely for revenge. But the more I heard about the things you did and the danger she was in, our plan changed.
He intends to kill Lee and take care of Clementine himself, and...
Hey, honey. I think this is all gonna work out.
What are you...
I'm glad too.
Well, that seems like a less than great idea. Thankfully, Clementine is still resourceful and brave and allows you an opportunity to fight him. Depending on how you play this, either you kill him or Clementine shoots him before he can kill you. On the way out, Lee and Clementine discover another trick of the Walking Dead universe. Covering yourself in walker gore makes them not pay attention to you. So Lee covers a reluctant Clementine in the stuff and the two walk straight out onto the street, heading out successfully until... Lee wakes up in a small building. Clementine got them off the streets and locked them in. It's at this point, of course, that Lee has to inform her of his bite.
What happened? No, that's not... No.
Yes, Clem, it is.
Slowly and painstakingly, Lee walks Clementine through the process of taking out the zombie in the other room and getting out, instructing her each step of the way, trusting she can take care of it on her own and only intervening in one brief, desperate moment. As Lee, we have been an example for Clementine. We protected her, we prepared her to protect herself, and now we're walking her through that process. This is the learning process, and we're at the final step. This scene is our final time working together, and it's heart-wrenching. Once Clementine is able to leave, we're faced with one final choice.
Please. Please don't be one of them. Please don't become a walker.
There's only one thing you can do. You know that.
I don't know if I can.
Whichever you choose, this is the last time Lee and Clementine see each other, and the game ends with Clementine all alone until she sees two people on the horizon. Now it's time to get into the meat of this analysis. My goal with this video is to determine what The Walking Dead means and how it uses interactivity to mean it. So, first up, what is this game trying to say? There's only so much we can say before we dig into the game's use of interactivity, but there are some key overarching themes of the game regardless of the choices you make. Obviously, there are a lot of little things scattered around the various episodes and character arcs of the game, but they tend to relate back to one core concept: loss. Loss of humanity, loss of life, loss of privilege, loss of security, loss of love, loss of, well, everything. That much is pretty obvious, though. I mean, any post-apocalyptic story is inherently going to have one or another level of themes of loss. I mean, the base concept for the entire genre is the loss of humanity and everything we've built, so that's just kind of automatic. But the best examples of post-apocalyptic literature are going to take that in specific directions and use that to inform interesting characters and make unique statements through them. Most of the characters in this game can be summed up in how they react to loss. Clementine couldn't accept her loss and hung on to it for hope until she saw it confirmed with her own eyes. Kenny still had his family, far and away the most important thing to him, so when everything else was gone, he still clung to them for purpose. When they died, he still clung to them until, if your choices led to this, his forgiveness of Ben. Lily's loss of her father resulted in a loss of faith in the people around her, resulting in paranoia that led her to lose her grasp on reality. The stranger's loss of his family both drove him mad and inspired him to cause more pain and loss for others. Ben reacted to loss with fear, Chuck with escapism and eventually altruism, Molly with rejection of the circumstances that took her sister from her. Every one of these characters is defined by what they lost and how they react to its absence. Lee is the only major exception, and that's very intentional. He's meant to be your avatar after all, so he started in a position where he'd basically already lost everything. What little remained for him to lose, the game got out of the way first thing so you wouldn't be burdened with the grief of a character whose life you haven't lived. So his reaction to loss is simply to latch onto Clementine, to devote himself to her protection, a goal that any player can get behind regardless of how well they relate to Lee as a character. And ultimately, the game establishes the value of everything that can be lost, which is to say, everything has value. No loss is insignificant. Some may be necessary, but it's no less tragic for that. This is probably best illustrated with Kenny and Ben's relationship. Kenny was rightfully angry at Ben for indirectly leading to the death of his wife and son, and it wasn't until Ben finally just let out his own feelings about his own loss that Kenny was taken down a notch. Kenny was suffering more visibly, his trauma probably greater, but he wasn't the only one whose life was now defined by what he no longer had, and to that end, Ben's mistakes didn't ultimately matter. He was another person just trying to live in the world of the dead. His life had value. His loss, however justified, would be a loss not just for himself or those who cared about him, but for humanity as a whole. It can be hard to see things like that in the heat of the moment, or from the perspectives of the people living in this hell, but in The Walking Dead, people aren't defined by their mistakes or their losses or their priorities. People are just people, and their existence is the only thing that keeps this world alive. Only once we step back from it all, away from the grief and anger and fear, can we really see that, but it's true. In The Walking Dead, no loss is too small to matter. But that's a pretty broad thematic claim, and ultimately, player choice is so integral to this game that we can't fully understand what it means without also understanding the role of our interaction in this story. Now, The Walking Dead features choice all along the spectrum of major and minor narrative interactivity. Quick refresher. Major and minor narrative interactivity refers to the type of effect your interaction with a game's story has on the game itself. Major interactivity is the big choices, the one that change the story in a tangible way. Minor interactivity is for those instances where simply participating in the events of the game makes the story more powerful. In both cases, a game is utilizing the medium's unique interactive properties, just in different ways. Player choice is obviously a central component to The Walking Dead, and manifests in a variety of different ways for a variety of different purposes. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to break this down into two broad categories. The game's major interactivity primarily shows through choices that have tangible, usually immediate consequences. Saving Doug or Carly, letting Ben die or saving him, sending Lily away or keeping her with the group. These choices allow you to exert your influence on the story and its characters in a tangible way. Not always a permanent one, but we'll get to that in a bit. The game's minor interactivity still manifests in the form of player choice more often than not, but in more subtle ways. Your attitude and choice of words, your little gestures to Clementine, your smaller choices that don't really change anything beyond a line of dialogue. These choices still technically have an effect on the game, but it's much smaller. The general approach to choice in video games, both in their development and in the surrounding culture, has trained us to see more value in the major choices than the minor ones. But to dismiss minor narrative interactivity like that is to miss much of this game's meaning. In the olden days of gaming, player choice was almost entirely represented by the concept of multiple endings. This was the ultimate expression of yourself in a game, that your choices could lead to completely different outcomes. Both game technology and the art of video game design lacked the complexity to do much more than that at the time, but The Walking Dead has a different goal. It doesn't use your choices to give you new perspectives on the game and its story, it uses your choices to give you a new perspective on yourself. Going back to the food distribution scene as an example, your choices will ultimately mean very little to the progression of the narrative. No one is gonna starve to death because you didn't give them food or even hold a lasting grudge against you. Instead, this sequence further defines you. It hands you a difficult situation in which it's impossible to do what's best for everyone, and makes you experience the desperation and guilt inherent in such things. This is a defining moment in understanding how desperate and cruel the world of The Walking Dead is, and one that is made exceptionally more impactful because you have to choose. And this is ultimately the most powerful and important element of The Walking Dead's approach to player choice. Not that your choices change the story, but that they shape your own perception of who you are. One of the unique powers of video games is that of introspection. You can of course see a reflection of yourself in any story and use that as an opportunity for self-examination, but in something like this, there is no reflection. It's just you. Self-examination is not optional when a game puts you into a situation and asks you to make a decision. The Walking Dead is, at its core, a test. A simulation that puts you in difficult situations and asks what you will do. It's meant to inspire introspection, so that you can look at your choices and ask yourself who you are and if this is who you want to be. And make no mistake, who lives, who dies, and whose fault it is by the end of this story has absolutely no relevance on how effectively it can accomplish that goal. Ben may die in the end regardless of your choices, but tell me, would you think the same way about a person who let him die in that tower as you would about a person who refused to give up on him until the end? For that matter, do you really think Kenny's character arc is the same when Ben is killed early on versus when he chooses to forgive him for the death of his family? Kenny's gonna crush Larry's head regardless of your choice, but is the Lee who chose not to give up on him really the same Lee who chose to assume it's hopeless and end it right then? The stranger may capture Clementine even if you don't steal the food, but how could you look at this story and say that your example to Clementine in that instance doesn't carry thematic weight? I'm gonna get a little personal here for the sake of examples, because the introspective nature of this game often shines brightest when you compare your experience with it to that of someone else. When I played through this the first time, I took it upon myself to shoot Duck, because I felt a father should never have to do something so horrible. But soon after I played this game, my brother-in-law, whose son was just born at the time, played it, and he had Kenny do it. I couldn't understand this choice, so I asked why. In his eyes, it was Kenny's responsibility. As a father himself, my brother-in-law believed it would be wrong for anyone but Duck's father to do this. Our difference in this choice helped me understand him better, and the ability to see such an emotional scenario from a different perspective was enlightening. But for all the emotional impact this game had on me, and it's a lot, there is one choice in particular that still haunts me. Even after many years and multiple playthroughs, because it is the only choice in any video game that has ever actually brought me to abandon my principles. When Lily shot Carly, I was shocked, upset, angry, and confused. I really liked Carly, and this violent action was so sudden I couldn't immediately process what had happened. I left Lily by the side of the road, knowing full well she would probably die. I later realized I didn't know if that was the right decision, but what scared me more was that, in the moment, I didn't care. Another person's life was in my hands, and I made my decision based solely on my shock, grief, and anger. That's a terrifying thing to realize about oneself. Of course, if you keep her with you, she's just going to steal the RV while you're working on the train, so she's removed from the story either way. My choice had an immediate effect, but not a lasting one, and ultimately the result was the same regardless. But that does absolutely nothing to change what that choice meant to me, what it meant about my Lee, and more importantly, what it said about me. Because here's the thing. The Walking Dead is a story that you take part in. And it's not the story of a chosen messiah saving the world, or the first human specter saving the galaxy, or the lone wanderer bringing water back to the wasteland. It's the story of a man trying to do the best he can to survive and protect a little girl as the world falls apart around him. This is not a story where you have control. Other characters will act independently of the choices you make. Tragedy will strike whether you want it to or not, and not even everything that you choose to do will turn out the way you hope it will. And that's exactly how it needs to be. To criticize The Walking Dead for allowing other characters or events to override your choices is to criticize it for being a character piece instead of a power fantasy. Ultimately, a lot of power fantasy ideas are basically coded into our expectations, because video games catered to that concept almost exclusively for the first few decades of their existence, and still, more often than not today, they still do. But that's not what The Walking Dead is, and to change it into one would effectively destroy everything it's trying to accomplish. Because The Walking Dead isn't about the great things you can accomplish. It's about what you do when your back is against the wall, when it seems like there's no more good in the world, when your influence is limited, and all you can do is the best you can and hope that others, the ones who depend on you, look up to you, and rely on you, can carry your intentions further than you can. And Clementine is the ultimate expression of this theme. The entire game is about doing what you can for her, doing your best to protect and train her until you literally cannot do that anymore. Your influence is not absolute. You can't ensure any outcome for her. You can't act in such a way that everything falls into place to leave her a perfect, safe ending. You can only act in her best interests, as well as you can, until ultimately your influence on her is all that's left. And it's up to her to make the best of what you've given her. And that is the heart of this game. The Walking Dead is about your impact on others. Your life and your influence may be finite, but it's your effect on the people around you that will expand your impact far beyond the loss of your own life. You won't be able to control everything that happens, and a lot of the things that you do are ultimately going to end up in the hands of other people. And that's fine. You don't need ultimate power over everything that happens to make a difference in the lives of those around you. You can do that even at your least powerful, your most helpless and most vulnerable. And ultimately, that's what matters more. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe learned a little more about a modern classic. If you have anything interesting about your experiences with The Walking Dead to share, feel free to talk about them in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and check the description for links to Games Is Lit 101 on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. The next few weeks we'll be back to normal Games Is Lit related miscellaneous stuff. And for my next analysis, I'll be getting back to Patreon-sponsored requests with Dust and Elysian Tale. So until then, class dismissed.
Sometimes it's better not to care. And I can see your smile is withered. One more autumn leaf is drifting on the wind. Innocence is wasted, and I'm so sorry that you never can replace it. The darkest road ahead, you're gonna have to face it, 'cause I can't always be there. For now I'll do the best I can. You